The next 3 videos, I am doing one on aperture, I'm doing one on ISO, and I'm doing one on shutter speed. And those are what I call the three-legged stool for exposure. So let's move on to aperture, which is this video. We often think of the aperture as your iris, that part. It's the hole that light comes into your camera. The iris can get larger and let more light in, or the iris can contract and let less light in. Now on the camera, we have one other thing to deal with, and that's depth of field, and I'm going to talk about that later. But overall, the main function of aperture is letting more light in or less light in. When people talk about aperture, they talk about it in terms of your f-stops. You'll see f4, 16. You'll see numbers as low as f 1.4. A common low number is f 2.8. What aperture were you shooting at? You could reply f5.6, f6, f8. And lenses will have different numbers available. You won't have every number available on all of your lenses. It's actually expressed as a fraction. So 1/2, 1/2, is what we call f2. Lop off the 1, and that's your f-stop. So when you think about a pie, you'd say, do you want half of a pie, or would you like a quarter of a pie? And the answer is most definitely, yes, I want half of a pie, and that is the bigger piece. So 1/2 is bigger than 1/4. And when we talk about aperture, we express it as just 2 instead of 1/2. So f2 is bigger than f4, which is also bigger than f8, which is like 1/8. So the couple things we need to remember when discussing aperture. One, I'm never prepared, am I? Someday I'm going to tell you about this camera. This one is Kodak SLR-N. It's a monster. You know what? I'm going to use this one in the ISO video. So come back and check the ISO video and learn about this museum relic. It's 85mm lens, which it has the biggest aperture in it. Come on, where is the button? Boop. This is the aperture. This is how much light is let through the lens. Boop, boop, boop. A small number is a wide opening. A large number is a small opening. Small number, large number. Small number, large number. More of me. Upside down. This is not the most technical explanation. Boop, boop, boop. And what I'm most interested in is not figuring the exact technical specs of everything, but to have a great working knowledge that allows you to use the camera to do what you want to do. Why not always just use the smaller number and let as much light in as possible? Why would you ever want to use the bigger number? That is a good question. You ask the best questions. You really do. You ask wonderful questions. And that question leads me to the next point of discussing aperture, is needing to understand something called depth of field. Your aperture affects your depth of field. I'm going to have a full video on depth of field later, not yet. But you do need to understand depth of field when you're trying to understand aperture, because it's one of the primary things aperture does. We know that aperture lets light in, right, through the lens, but the other thing the aperture does is when you open up and let more light in, you effectively make less stuff in focus. And that's your depth of field. Your depth of field is like this. All right, so then I'm going to do that video and I'll narrate it later. You know, that kind of thing. I did not finish aperture yesterday. I just have to add one little addendum, and that's that thing on depth of field. What did I say? I said... where was I? Your depth of field is like this. Depth of field is like this. So the depth of field describes how much is in focus in front of the thing you're focusing on and how much is in focus in back of the thing you're focusing on. So if this camera is focusing on this pin and things 1 inch in front of it are in focus and things 1.5 inches behind it are in focus, this depth of field would be 2.5 inches because it includes what's in front and what's in back. My focus right now is on that W. And as I make my depth of field larger, as I choose a larger number, more of the objects in front and in back of the corner of that W are in focus because I'm expanding my depth of field. All right, so this is f1.4. You can see it has a very small depth of field. As I continue to stop down my aperture, as I go to f2.8 and f4 and f8, that depth of field will get larger. And then now I'm going to just stop it down, is what we'd say. Stop it down to f2.8, and you can see that you start to see a little more of the A and the R. Move to f4, remove the little string there. At f4, you even see even more of the A and R, and the T, the V, start to come into focus just a little bit. Now let's go to f8, and you can see everything's just getting a little more clear. And now let's try f16. And for this particular one, we just don't have enough light, right? Because we've stopped down so small right now that you can see the sensor is just not getting enough light, and the whole scene is darkened a little bit. You can see that all the letters are much more clear. And now let's go back to f1.4. And you can see again that you get back to that really small depth of field. Now we talk about that small depth of field as a consequence. It's something you can use creatively, right? A small depth of field, if you want to just show one thing and one thing alone, that's something that you want to leverage, and you want a small depth of field. So for every action you do to let more light in, there's a consequence. Consequences, if you get creative, are not always bad. So with Aperture, if you let more light in, you get a smaller depth of field. So small number aperture, small depth of field. That's an easy way to remember it. Big aperture, big depth of field. Now if you're trying to remember more light, well then now we have to reverse it and it's small number more light, right? It's kind of, you're just gonna have to memorize it, right? You just sit down and memorize it. Small number, a lot of light. Big number, a little bit of light. So that pretty well sums up Aperture. It's not too confusing. Oh,